This is John Miller, who is about to try and fly on 0 hours of sleep. He thinks all will be fine as the trip is short, but it would end in disaster. Today we will be going over his story and what exactly happened, starting with the morning of departure. John Miller's hands trembled as he poured his fourth cup of coffee into his favorite aviation mug, drops of dark liquid splattering onto the pristine kitchen counter. The digital clock on the microwave blinked 4:13 a.m., mocking his 23 hours of wakefulness. "John, please." Sarah's voice cracked with worry as she stood in her blue bathrobe, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You haven't slept since yesterday morning. This isn't safe." "I've flown tired before," he mumbled, avoiding his wife's concerned gaze. "The weather's perfect, and I need to get these parts to the Henderson airfield today." The kitchen lights felt harsh against his burning eyes. John blinked hard, trying to focus on the flight plan spread across the counter. The numbers seemed to dance on the page, forcing him to squint to make sense of them. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder. "The delivery can wait until tomorrow. You're not thinking clearly. I watched you put the milk in the pantry 10 minutes ago." John shrugged off her touch, irritation flaring through his exhaustion. At 45, he'd logged over 2,000 flight hours in his Cessna 172. He knew what he was doing. The coffee would kick in soon enough, and the crisp morning air would wake him up once he got to the airfield. "I made a commitment," he said, shoving his flight charts into his bag. "Henderson's counting on these parts. Their crop duster's been grounded for 3 days." His wife's face hardened. "And what about your commitment to me? To staying alive?" The word stung, but John was too tired to argue. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door, his movements clumsy as he pushed his arms through the sleeves. The world seemed to tilt slightly as he bent down to pick up his flight bag. Just fatigue, he told himself, nothing he couldn't handle. "I'll be back for dinner," he said, not meeting Sarah's eyes. "It's just a 2-hour flight each way." "John!" Sarah's voice followed him to the garage, but he pretended not to hear. Inside his car, John rested his forehead against the steering wheel for just a moment. His eyelids felt like they were weighted with lead. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that Sarah was right. But pride and stubbornness won out. He'd been flying since he was 18. He could handle one more trip. As he backed out of the driveway, he caught a glimpse of Sarah standing in the doorway, her figure blurred by his tired eyes. The sight of her made his stomach twist with guilt, but he pushed the feeling aside. He was a pilot, and pilots got the job done, no matter what. The pre-dawn darkness wrapped around his car like a heavy blanket as he drove toward the small municipal airport, unaware that his next decision would be one he'd live to regret. The day before had started like any other Thursday. John had woken up at 5 a.m. for an early delivery flight, expecting to be home by noon. But nothing had gone according to plan. And at first, there had been the thunderstorm that forced him to divert to a small airport in the next state. He'd spent hours in the pilot's lounge, watching radar screens, and waiting for the weather to clear. When it finally did, his next flight revealed a concerning noise in the engine that required immediate attention. "Better safe than sorry," the mechanic had said, his face smeared with grease as he worked well into the evening. John had paced the hangar, making calls to reschedule deliveries and watching the sun sink below the horizon. By the time he finally got home at midnight, his schedule was in shambles. Instead of going to bed, he'd spent hours at his desk, reorganizing flight plans and making promises to customers. The Henderson delivery became his top priority. They needed those parts desperately, and he'd given his word. John had been flying since before he could drive a car. His father, also a pilot, had taught him everything about aviation, drilling safety protocols into his head from day one. "A tired pilot is a dangerous pilot," his dad used to say. The memory of those words flickered through his exhausted mind as he pulled into the airport parking lot. The small municipal airport was quiet at this early hour. John's footsteps echoed across the empty terminal as he made his way to the weather station. His eyes struggled to focus on the computer screen as he checked the conditions. The numbers blurred together, and he had to read them 3 times before they made sense. Clear skies, light winds, perfect visibility. But something wasn't right with his own visibility. The room seemed to swim slightly when he turned his head too quickly. Twice now he'd caught himself starting to nod off while sitting at the weather station. His hand shook as he filled out the flight plan, his usually neat handwriting looking more like a child's scrawl. Simple calculations that he normally did in seconds now required him to count on his fingers. He couldn't remember if he needed to add or subtract the wind correction angle, something he'd done thousands of times before. Walking out to his Cessna 172, John stumbled over nothing. The pre-flight checklist, normally as familiar as breathing, felt foreign in his hands. He had to keep going back, double and triple checking items he'd already verified. Just get through the next few hours, he muttered to himself, patting the white and blue fuselage of his plane. The aircraft had been his pride and joy for the past 5 years, a reliable partner in building his small delivery business. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, painting the airfield in shades of gray. John's watch showed 5:15 a.m., 24 hours since his last sleep. He knew the statistics. Being awake for 24 hours was like having a blood alcohol level of 10, well above the legal limit for driving, let alone flying. But pride is a powerful thing. John had never failed to complete a delivery, and he wasn't about to start now. Besides, he reasoned, he'd pushed through fatigue before. What was one more flight? As he climbed into the cockpit, he didn't notice that he'd skipped 3 items on his pre-flight checklist. His tired mind was already focused on the destination, ignoring the warning signs that were becoming clearer with each passing minute. The Cessna's engine roared to life, its familiar rumble doing little to shake John's growing drowsiness. He squinted at the instrument panel, the green and red lights blending together in a confusing array. Blinking hard, he forced himself to focus on the pre-takeoff checklist. Tower, this is November. 347 Lima Papa, ready for takeoff, he said into his headset, his words slightly slurred. There was a pause before the controller responded, longer than usual, though in his fatigued state, John didn't notice. November 347. Lima Papa, cleared for takeoff. Runway 27. The plane rolled down the runway, gathering speed. John's hands felt heavy on the controls as he pulled back, lifting the nose into the air. The horizon tilted oddly as he climbed, forcing him to make several corrections that would normally be unnecessary. At 1,000 feet, he noticed he'd forgotten to retract the flaps. A rookie mistake. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as he corrected the error, though there was no one around to witness it. The morning sun peeked over the horizon, its rays piercing straight into his tired eyes. Stay awake, he muttered, shaking his head vigorously. Just stay awake. The Cessna leveled off at 3,000 feet, but John couldn't seem to hold a steady altitude. The plane drifted up and down by hundreds of feet without him noticing. His eyes kept closing for what felt like split seconds, but each time he jerked awake, the plane had drifted off course. Twice he caught himself in a microsleep, those dangerous few seconds when the brain shuts down despite best efforts to stay awake. The second time, he awoke to find the plane had banked 15 degrees to the right. His heart raced as he corrected course, adrenaline temporarily clearing his mind. The coffee he'd drunk earlier churned in his stomach, making him feel queasy. He reached for his water bottle but knocked it over, spilling water across the cockpit floor. The sound of liquid sloshing around only added to his disorientation. Through the windshield, the landscape below appeared to move in slow motion. Fields and forests merged into a green blur. John blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. He couldn't remember if he was supposed to turn at the next river or the one after that. The radio crackled with routine traffic, but the voices seemed distant and garbled. John had to ask the controller to repeat instructions twice, something he'd never done before. His responses were delayed and confused. November 347. Lima Papa, say altitude. The controller's voice cut through his fog. Nah. John glanced at his altimeter, but the numbers wouldn't stay still. He was shocked to see he'd descended to 2,500 feet without realizing it. Climbing back to 3,000, he responded, embarrassment coloring his voice. His hands felt disconnected from his brain as he adjusted the controls. Simple adjustments became complex tasks. The muscle memory built over thousands of flight hours was failing him, replaced by slow, uncertain movements. The morning sun had fully risen now, but instead of energizing him, it made his eyes water and burn. He fumbled for his sunglasses, nearly dropping them between the seats. As he reached for them, the plane dipped again. A warning light began flashing on the instrument panel. John stared at it, his tired mind struggling to process what it meant. Was it the oil pressure? Fuel pump? The symbols that had been second nature to him for decades now seemed like hieroglyphics. Just 3 more hours, he told himself, not realizing he'd said it out loud. Just stay awake for 3 more hours. But his body was fighting a losing battle against exhaustion. Each blink lasted longer than the last, each head bob brought him closer to disaster. The plane continued its journey through the morning sky, its pilot's judgment deteriorating with every passing minute. In the distance, dark clouds were gathering, though John's fatigue-clouded mind hadn't noticed them yet. The weather report he'd read earlier was already 3 hours old, and conditions were changing rapidly. The perfect flying day was about to become anything but perfect. The first sign of real trouble came when John noticed the engine making an unusual sputtering sound. His tired mind took several precious seconds to process what was happening. The RPMs began to drop and the plane started losing altitude. Through his fatigue-clouded thoughts, John fumbled with the controls. His hands felt like they were moving through molasses as he tried to remember his emergency procedures. 25 hours without sleep had reduced his reaction time and decision-making ability to dangerous levels. The dark clouds he'd ignored earlier now surrounded him. His instruments showed readings that didn't make sense to his exhausted brain. Numbers and indicators that should have been familiar after thousands of flight hours now seemed like a foreign language. A warning light began flashing on his panel. John blinked hard, trying to focus. Was it the fuel pump? Oil pressure? His mind couldn't process the information quickly enough. The fatigue had severely impaired his ability to handle multiple tasks at once, a skill that was crucial during emergencies. The plane pitched unexpectedly and John overcorrected, making the situation worse. His hands were shaking now, both from exhaustion and fear. He knew he should radio for help, but forming coherent sentences had become surprisingly difficult. "Mayday," he finally managed to croak into his headset. "November 347, Lima Papa. Experiencing engine troubles." "Edit." The controller's voice came back immediately, but John had to ask him to repeat the instructions twice. His brain couldn't seem to hold on to the information for more than a few seconds. Each time the controller spoke, the words seemed to slip away like water through his fingers. The engine's sputtering grew worse. John's microsleeps, those dangerous few seconds when his brain would shut down despite his best efforts to stay awake, were becoming more frequent. Each time he caught himself nodding off, the plane would drift off course or lose altitude. And through the windshield, the ground below was becoming clearer as the plane continued its gradual descent. John's training told him he needed to find a place to land, but his fatigued mind couldn't focus long enough to make a proper assessment of his options. The controller was saying something about a nearby airfield, but John's attention was split between too many tasks: watching his altitude, fighting to keep his eyes open, trying to restart the engine, and searching for a landing spot. His normal ability to multitask had completely disappeared. In his exhausted state, John made a critical error. Instead of following his emergency checklist step by step, he started randomly trying different things, hoping something would work. His decision-making ability had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer think clearly about the consequences of his actions. The plane continued to lose altitude, and the engine's sputtering grew worse. Warning lights were now flashing across his instrument panel, but John's overtired brain couldn't process them all at once. He had reached the point where fatigue was affecting every aspect of his performance, from his physical coordination to his mental clarity. As the ground grew closer, John finally realized the full gravity of his situation. Sarah had been right. He should never have taken off in this condition. But that realization came too late as the plane's engine gave one final sputter before falling silent completely. With the engine dead silent, the only sound in the cockpit was John's ragged breathing and the whistle of wind over the wings. The ground was rushing up faster now, the trees and fields becoming clearer with each passing second. Through his exhaustion, one clear thought finally broke through. He needed to land the plane. His training kicked in, though delayed by his fatigue. He spotted a fallow field ahead, brown and flat, his best chance for survival. "November 347 Lima Papa going down," he managed to radio, his words slurring. "Attempting emergency landing in field, 5 miles south of—" His voice trailed off as he concentrated on keeping the wings level. The Cessna glided toward the field, but John's dulled reflexes made controlling the plane nearly impossible. He was too high, then too low, then too high again. His hands trembled on the controls as he tried to line up his approach. At 200 feet, a gust of wind caught the left wing. John overcorrected and the plane yawed sharply to the right. The ground spun in his vision as he fought to regain control. Trees blurred past the windshield as the plane descended at the wrong angle. The impact came faster than he expected. The right wheel caught the ground first, sending the plane skidding sideways. Metal screamed against earth as the wingtip dug into the soil. The world turned upside down as the Cessna cartwheeled across the field, pieces of the aircraft scattering in all directions. When the motion finally stopped, John found himself hanging upside down in his seat harness, the taste of blood in his mouth. The cockpit had crumpled around him, but somehow left enough space for survival. Through the shattered windshield, he could see dirt and sky mixed together in a disorienting view. His last conscious thought before the darkness took him was of Sarah's face in the doorway, watching him leave. She had been right all along. The simple act of getting enough sleep could have prevented all of this. The sound of approaching sirens pierced through his fading consciousness. Someone had seen the crash and called for help. As John slipped into unconsciousness, the morning sun filtered through the wreckage, illuminating the scattered pieces of his pride and stubbornness across the empty field. 3 days later, John sat in his hospital bed, his right arm in a cast and stitches running along his forehead. The doctors had told him he was lucky. The crash could have been fatal. Instead, he'd escaped with a broken arm, a concussion, and a hefty dose of humility. Sarah sat beside his bed, holding his good hand. She hadn't said, "I told you so," but she didn't need to. The FAA investigators' report had been clear. Pilot fatigue was the primary cause of the crash. John's judgment had been severely impaired by his 25 hours without sleep, leading to poor decision-making and slowed reactions. His pilot's license was suspended pending a full investigation. The Cessna, his pride and joy for 5 years, was a total loss. But these consequences paled in comparison to what could have happened. He could have crashed into a populated area, or worse, been carrying passengers. As he watched the afternoon sun stream through his hospital window, John thought about all the times he'd pushed himself too far, believing he was invincible. Now he understood what his father had always tried to teach him. Being a good pilot wasn't about proving how much you could handle. It was about knowing when to stay on the ground.